Welcome to today's IEEE Geoscience and Remote Sensing Society webinar. We're so glad you're joining us. United by the mission to advance geoscience and remote sensing, GRSS is dedicated to knowledge sharing by ensuring transparent, accessible, and collaborative learning for all. And our webinars are just one way we bring that commitment to life. Designed for students, early career researchers, professionals, and enthusiasts, these webinars address foundational topics as well as a wide range of emerging subjects, while also offering sessions on academic writing, publishing, and career planning. Our webinars are made possible through the collaborative efforts of GRSS's technical committees and various other initiatives, bringing together a diverse community of experts to deliver high-quality learning content. During the webinar, please submit your questions through the Q&A feature, and they'll be addressed at the end. You'll be asked to complete a survey afterwards, which helps us tailor content to your interests. Be sure to check out the IEEE GRSS YouTube channel for previous webinar recordings in case you missed any. And for updates on future webinars, visit the GRSS calendar and follow us on social media. We're excited to have you with us. Let's dive in.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Adnan Siddiq, Chair of the REACT Technical Committee. I welcome you all to this webinar. In fact, this is the first webinar from the REACT TC for the year 2026. And I'm happy we have quite a bunch of participants here today. And well, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Simon Zwieback, who's our guest today. He's an excellent scientist, and today he will be giving a talk on remote sensing of permafrost vulnerability and geohazard. This talk will briefly review permafrost and remote sensing of permafrost landscapes, and then it will focus on remote sensing of ground ice. About Dr. Simon Zwieback, he's an assistant professor at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. He received his PhD in environmental engineering from ETH Zurich, Switzerland in 2016. He's a remote sensing expert, he's a geospatial data analysis expert, and he has been studying land surface processes in the permafrost regions for quite some time. He has numerous grants to his name. He has several publications around radar remote sensing theory and algorithm development. And I can speak a lot about that, but without further ado, Simon Zwieback, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for attending. Let me share my screen. Yeah, I'm really excited to be presenting this webinar on remote sensing of permafrost and geohazards that are associated with permafrost. So across the Arctic, communities are seeing their landscapes transform. One essential component of this change is permafrost. Permafrost is ground that remains below the freezing point for multiple years. And permafrost is the foundation of these landscapes in the Arctic, such as the one you can see here in this image, which is from the Inuvialuit settlement region in the Northwestern Territories in Canada. These permafrost landscapes can contain ice, lots of ice, and it is the melting of this ice that makes the ground unstable. So for instance, this thaw slump you can see here that I'm currently pointing at, it expands through exactly this process, the melting of ground ice. In this talk, I'll provide an overview of permafrost, what makes it vulnerable to geohazards such as this retrogressive thaw slump, and how we can use remote sensing to help meet challenges associated with these geohazards. At the beginning, I would like to provide a very brief overview of permafrost. I'm sorry, I'm struggling with my multi-screen setup. Okay, so let's provide an overview of permafrost. So it's defined to be ground that remains below 0 degrees Celsius for at least 2 years. And around 22% of the Northern Hemisphere land surface are affected by permafrost. So permafrost covers a large area, but it's actually very heterogeneous in terms of the permafrost conditions that we encounter across the Arctic and further south. If we start, for instance, in the high Canadian Arctic, such as Banks Island that I'm currently pointing at, there the permafrost is very cold. The ground temperatures are around -10 degrees. And permafrost underlies essentially the entire landscape there. As we go further south, generally speaking, the permafrost temperatures get warmer. And at some point, more and more of the landscape starts to become free of permafrost. So the further south you go, for instance, once we go here into this area in northern Canada, most of the land will actually not be underlain by permafrost, but there will be pockets of permafrost across the landscape. And irrespective of whether permafrost is very cold and underlies the entire landscape, or as we go further south, when it underlies less and less of the landscape, it's really important to know where that permafrost is and what its conditions are. This permafrost, being below the freezing point, it can contain ice, and that is what I'm going to be focusing on through much of this talk. But it's not only the ice that we care about. There's also nutrients in the permafrost, and once the permafrost thaws, these nutrients become accessible to plants. There's contaminants, and there's lots of organic carbon that we care about from a climate change perspective. So we really need to know how permafrost is changing over time. And well, if you want, unfortunately, or one thing we've been observing is that many permafrost landscapes are changing very, very rapidly. And we'll return to the Inuvialuit settlement region, to exactly that same spot we looked at on the title slide, to get a glimpse of how rapidly these landscapes can be changing. So on the left, you can see a picture from 2005, and on the right, you can see an aerial picture from 2017. And you will notice that this small patch of the landscape has changed substantially. So what are some of the changes we can see? Well, one of them is the thaw slump we already looked at, which formed between 2005 and 2017. It actually formed in around 2008, and then it expanded rapidly by up to tens of meters a year until 2017. With that thaw slump, lots of changes occurred. For instance, one change you can see is that the lake color has changed substantially. So this thaw slump has mobilized sediments and other materials, and that has a big impact on the aquatic ecosystems. What other changes of this landscape can we see? Well, one other change that's pretty apparent are these regularly patterned features you can see here in the upper right corner. And they have become much more prominent. You can see they have become dark. And what that means is that they have become inundated with water. And that was driven by essentially the collapse at the surface, either just these smaller troughs, or in this particular case, you can see a larger pit. And that is also formed by the melting of ground ice, but a different type of ground ice than what drove the thaw slump. And with this change of these what's called ice wedge polygons, we have many changes to the way the landscape functions in a hydrological sense. It also has a big impact on how animals navigate across this landscape, and also about how humans may navigate across this landscape. There's one third change associated with ground ice, and that is one that we actually cannot see very easily from this high resolution image. And that is that most of the landscape here is subsided over this time period by several centimeters. And that's a very gradual, somewhat, if you look at it very roughly speaking, pretty uniform subsidence over time. But that is still a hazard, for instance, if you've got a building somewhere on this landscape. And also this subsidence is driven by the melting of ground ice. But again, it's a different type of ground ice than what actually drove the thaw slump and what drove the degradation of these ice wedge polygons. So ground ice is a major component of how this landscape is changing. And permafrost more generally is a major driver of how this landscape is changing. One other change that we see here that doesn't directly relate to ground ice, but indirectly relates to permafrost, is that you can see that many of these shrubs have expanded. They've become denser, they've become taller, and that is partially driven by the thawing of permafrost and by the release of nutrients, which promotes vegetation growth. Finally, there's one more change that has had a big impact on this landscape, and that is a big fire that happened in 2024. You can see it here in the upper right corner, where essentially half of that region that you can see a zoom in of, it was affected by a fire in 2023. So these landscapes in the Arctic, they are changing rapidly, and a big driver of that is permafrost, and more specifically ground ice. So this is something we really care about from a community perspective, because these landscapes are very important. They're important because people live there, so people's livelihoods depend on these permafrost landscapes. That's where they get their subsistence lifestyles from, so fisheries resources, and also a place to live, and many, many other aspects of their cultures and also of the economy, more broadly speaking. So livelihoods are impacted by changing permafrost landscapes. And we can see one example of this in Point Lay, that's an Inupiat community in Northwestern Alaska. You can see here a building that has clearly been affected by subsidence, and in particular, you can see here to the right, there is a small pond. And this is a location where the surface has subsided by 0.5 meter or so over a decadal timescale. And that has clearly impaired the integrity of this building, you can see here, which is a big deal for this community. What is it that drove the subsidence at this specific location and led to deformation of the pond? Well, the source of terrain instability was ground ice, as you won't be surprised to hear. And specifically, it was what's called Yeduma ice wedges. And you can see an example of such Yeduma in a nearby area where it is exposed along a river bluff. You can see these shiny parts here on the river bluff, so where the texture, the optical texture is pretty smooth. And this is all pure ice. These are big chunks of vertically oriented ice wedges that formed over the Pleistocene, over the Ice Age period, this area not being affected by glaciers. But over tens of thousands of years, these ice wedges formed as the surface rose up during these cold periods. And now there's a lot of ice in the ground, and the melting of this ice drives terrain instability with big impacts on communities, on hydrology, and on the global climate as well. Because this kind of permafrost that's called Yeduma also contains a lot of organic carbon, and as this permafrost degrades, this carbon becomes now accessible to microbes, and it may be turned into greenhouse gases. So we really care about these permafrost landscapes because they are very important, not just for the local community or on regional scales for instance, caribou migration. They're also really important globally from a climate perspective. And a lot of what drives the instability of these landscapes is ground ice. So the terrain instability we've seen that's driven by warming and thawing permafrost is triggered by the melting of ground ice. And this melting of ground ice can cause all kinds of changes to the landscape that all have in common that they relate to subsidence, the loss of strength, and the collapse of the landscape, as well as the infrastructure that's built on top of that landscape. Just to give you a few more examples of what these ground ice-induced instabilities can look like. On the left, we see a picture from northern Alaska. That's an aerial picture where we again see these regular polygonal troughs, and those formed over several years in the late 80s, early 90s during a very warm period. Before that, the landscape was pretty smooth, and now you can see there's all these pits and these ponds filled with water, and the way caribou navigate across these landscapes, the way waterfowl use these landscapes, all of that has changed completely because of terrain instability. Terrain instability is also a big topic of concern for people living in Alaska because it affects infrastructure. So for instance, when I drive to work, and if I wasn't snowed in, that's where I would be right now, I would be going over pretty rough roads, not quite as rough as this one you can see, but this is all due to the fact that ground ice has been melting, and that causes collapse of roads and other linear infrastructure features. It's also a big concern for buildings, such as the famous example that's shown here on the right. This is a building in Dawson City in Canada that I'm trying to put straight again by pushing on it. But you can see how these two parts of the building are leaning together. They're sometimes called the kissing buildings. And that's because there was more ice that melted right underneath the center of this compound of two buildings than there was on the side. So the takeaway message from this and previous slides is that ground ice is really, really important. It governs the stability or instability of these landscapes. The problem is, we don't know where the ground ice is. And this lack of knowledge from local scales to the global Arctic really limits our ability to sustainably plan infrastructure in these kinds of landscapes, for instance, when it comes to building new roads. And it also limits our ability to predict how the hydrology and the carbon cycle are going to change over the next decades and centuries. So what I want to focus on in the next 10-15 minutes is to talk more about what we can do to understand where the ground ice is and how much there is. And specifically what we want to do is we want to identify regions where the surface has remained stable so far, but where there is sufficient ground ice for instability to occur in the coming decades. I mentioned we basically don't have maps of ground ice, but in the last 5 years or so, there has been rapid progress in using various types of remote sensing to map where ground ice is. And there's basically 3 ways we can do it. And the first one is to look for ground ice related landforms such as the thaw slump we saw earlier and such as these ice wedge polygons that we saw earlier, or specifically we actually see their surficial expressions such as the troughs and the pits that I pointed at. And that is something that we can train a machine learning model to learn. And there have been various studies using deep learning to map these kinds of ground ice landforms. One very famous one is by Chandi Vitharana at the University of Connecticut, who looked at high-resolution commercial satellite imagery over the entire tundra region in the Arctic and used that to count the number of ice wedges that are actually visible at the surface. I should say there are many, many more that are not visible at the surface, both within this region you can see here, and then also further to the south as we go into more densely vegetated or forested areas where it's not so easy to apply these kinds of remote sensing. Overall, whenever we have these kinds of superficial expressions of ground ice, these new machine learning solutions are very, very useful and provide us a lot of valuable information that we can use to understand ground ice conditions on large scales. There's other approaches we can use machine learning for to map ground ice. And that works in areas where we don't necessarily have clear superficial expressions of ground ice, such as the presence of thaw slumps. And I refer to this as proxy-based remote sensing. And the idea is to use proxies such as the type of vegetation cover that's present or the topography on landscape scales to infer ground ice conditions. And this is a method that has been used by geological experts for long periods of time. So they have manually interpreted DEMs or topographic maps and high-resolution imagery to map to what extent they expect to see ground ice in different parts of a landscape, such as this part of the landscape we are looking at here. So for instance, one thing you can make out is that here in this river floodplain, it takes some geological knowledge to realize that this is a pretty young, geologically speaking, river floodplain. There we don't expect to see much ground ice, and certainly not near the surface. So previously this has been done by experts, but we can train machine learning models to do very similar things, and that has also seen quite a lot of interest in recent years. So that's method 2. The problem is that in many parts of landscapes, such as this one we can see here, there are areas where these types of proxy-based approaches don't work very well. So in order to fill that gap, there's one third approach we can use to understanding permafrost conditions, and specifically ground ice conditions, and that is INSAR, or interferometric synthetic aperture radar. And what we can do with that is we can measure how the ground subsides over time. So that can be within one season, or it can be between years and even decades if we get lucky. And as we observe how the ground subsides, that tells us something about how much ice there was, because it is the melting of the ice that drives subsidence. So we can use that subsidence information to understand how much ice is present using a number of assumptions that I will go into in a little bit. And with that, we can create regional maps of ground ice, such as the one you can see here, one that we will return to later, and where you can see that certain areas are mapped to have very low ground ice, those appear in blue. And for instance, the one I'm currently pointing at is a river floodplain, actually exactly the same one we looked at a minute or two ago. But in between, you can also see areas with a lot of ground ice, and that is a big concern for the local community, which is the community of Kivalina in Northwestern Alaska. So how does this INSAR approach work? Well, I now want to spend the next 10 minutes or so explaining how we can use INSAR to get these kinds of quantitative maps that you can see here, and that are basically without large gaps, so we can apply it everywhere across the landscape. So the idea is that we can measure the subsidence accurately with an accuracy of millimeters to centimeters using this remote sensing technique called INSAR, or interferometric synthetic aperture radar. That's going to be our main ingredient, our main input. How does it work? Well, at the most basic level, we have a radar antenna that we put on a satellite typically, and with that we make two measurements. These two measurements are separated in time, typically by 2 weeks or so. So on the left you can see the first pass where the antenna sends out an electromagnetic wave, which has a wavelength of typically 5 to 20 centimeters, and this wave travels with the speed of light from the antenna towards the surface. It is then reflected off that surface and travels all the way back to the satellite antenna, and that satellite antenna records the signal. Then 2 weeks later, we do the same trick again. So we send out this wave, which gets reflected, and we then record its return. Well, let's just imagine that on this second measurement, there has been subsidence off the ground. And because of that, the travel path from the antenna to the ground surface has increased in length. And that also means that it takes the electromagnetic wave more time to travel all the way to the surface and all the way back to the antenna. And we can measure the phase difference between these two reflected signals very accurately. So that is a measure of these fractional wave cycles that are indicated here in purple. We can measure that very accurately, and by doing some signal processing, we can turn that into an estimate of the amount of subsidence that happened at this location. In practice, we don't just do that once. So we don't just have two observations from which we can get one estimate of the displacement, but we actually make many, many observations every 12 days, and then we can build up a time series of subsidence. And now I want to explain how we can use such subseasonal time series, so regular observations over a summer period, to infer the amount of excess ice that is present. So on the left, that's what we observed. That's going to be the input to our method. What we observe is at any given location, at any pixel in our image, we can now measure how the ground subsides over time. And we'll always start, our time zero will always be just after snowmelt. And what you can see here is that the ground subsided rapidly initially, just after snowmelt. Then in this specific case, it subsided very, very slowly over a period of several weeks. And then towards the end of the summer, it subsided more rapidly again. So what does that subsidence rate and how it changes over time tell us about excess ice? Well, the idea is that the amount of ice that's present is going to govern the amount of subsidence that we see. And specifically, we know that the ground thaws from the top down. So just after snowmelt, the thaw front will be at the surface, and then over time, the thaw front progresses deeper and deeper. And at any given point in time, the location of the thaw front is where the ice is actually melting. And it is the melting of the ice at that depth that gives rise to the subsidence that we observe at that given point in time. So as time progresses, as we move to the right here on this observation time series, that corresponds to probing deeper and deeper layers of the ground. So in our specific case, if we start at the surface, we see here that there was a lot of excess ice. So excess ice is just jargon for ice that doesn't fit into the pore space. That's the ground ice we're actually going to measure. So here in this case, just at the surface, there's a lot of ice, and that corresponds to the large rate of subsidence, this very rapid subsidence early on in the thaw season. Then as we reached midsummer, the thaw front was just at this location that's shown here in brown, where there's very little excess ice, and that corresponds to very slow subsidence rates. So the surface is basically stable, almost stable at this point in time. And then in this, let's assume it was a very warm summer, the thaw front penetrated into these regions where the excess ice content was larger, so into ice-rich layers of the ground, and that's manifested as an acceleration of subsidence at the end of this summer. And this is what we really care about, because in a warm summer, the thaw front may penetrate into what was previously permafrost, so ground that may have been frozen for thousands of years. And this is the kind of ground ice that we care about, because it is this ice that will give rise to instability over the next decades or so. So this is what we will want to pick up. This profile that I just showed, where we have a lot of ice near the surface, then a little bit deeper down, than a lot of ice at depth, that is a very common situation that we encounter in the Arctic. And I will now want to show this using a core that we took in Northern Alaska. We're starting at the left, which is at the surface, and you can see the top 10 centimeters. So in this case, they contain very little ice because they're all organic. They're just like mossy materials. So a little bit different to the example we showed earlier. But then near the surface at around 10 centimeters, you can see these black bands. And these are all ice. These are what's called segregated ice. This is ice that formed in the previous fall as this part of the ground froze back. So we're not in the permafrost. This part of the ground freezes and thaws every year, and it's called the active layer. And near the surface here, these black lines, they indicate that there's substantial ice present, which was sucked towards these regions as the ground froze back in the previous fall. Then as we go deeper down, you can see that we stop seeing any of these black layers or ice lenses. And at a depth at around 30 centimeters, you don't see any of that. It looks what's called, the geologists call massive. So there's not much structure in terms of the ice that's present. And that's the central active layer that is typically very poor in ice. And the reason it's so poor in ice is because as the ground froze back, the water in the fall actually was sucked to the surface and also deeper down. So here we don't have a lot of ice, but as we go deeper down towards 40 centimeters, you can see more of these black ice lenses and various types of ground ice inclusions appearing. And then at 45 centimeters, there is a very clear break, and below that, the ground looks completely different. And in particular, it contains much more ice. You can see that ice as being shiny in certain places. You can also see it being transparent, right where I'm pointing at here. In other places, it's just dark. So there's a lot of ice here below 45 centimeters, and this is the permafrost. So this is part of the ground that doesn't freeze and thaw every year. But in a very warm summer, the thaw front may penetrate into these previously frozen materials, and that's a problem. Why is that a problem? Well, that's a problem because they contain so much ice. And just to give you an example, what happens if this ice melts when the ground thaws is we took this segment of the core and put it into a beaker, which you can see here on the right. And once we let that thaw and settle, you can see that basically the top 50% or so is water. And then if the beaker weren't present, that water would just drain away and the ground would consolidate. So this is what gives rise to subsidence and to the kind of terrain instability that we saw earlier. And the idea is that in a very warm summer, we can see some of that ice already start to melt, and we see that as subsidence at the end of that late summer, at the end of that warm summer. And that's what we can pick up with INSAR remote sensing. So let's just look at several examples of time series and related to the kinds of ground ice profiles we just looked at. So we're returning to Northwestern Alaska, and we're returning to the region I showed earlier. And let's actually start right at this floodplain I pointed out earlier as well. So I mentioned there we don't expect to see ground ice at depth, but there may be a little bit of ground ice just at the surface. And this is actually also what the INSAR data tell us. So with INSAR, you can see there was some subsidence, so lowering of the surface at the beginning of the summer, just after snowmelt. And after that, the ground remained stable in this very warm summer. And that indicates that there may have been some ice present right at the surface, but no ice deeper down, including in what used to be the permafrost in this very warm summer. Let's look at another location. And this location here, you can, if you squint, you can see that it's surrounded by regularly patterned features of the landscape. And these are actually ice wedge polygons. So just from image interpretation, we can already tell that this should be a location that has a lot of ice in the permafrost. And that is also what INSAR tells us. What we can see is that at the beginning of the summer, so in, let's say in early July, there was substantial subsidence indicating that ice was present near the surface in the upper active layer. Then as the thaw front penetrated deeper and deeper down, it went through that central desiccated active layer, and the surface position remained stable during that time period. And then at the end of this warm summer, the thaw front penetrated very ice-rich materials indicated by this substantial acceleration of subsidence at the end of the summer. So what INSAR tells us that in what used to be the permafrost at this location, there is plenty of ground ice present. Here at this location, we could have inferred that by other means too, but we can't see any indications of ground ice, such as these ice wedge polygons, as we go further up this hill slope, further away from the river. So up here on these ridges, it's really difficult to tell, even for experts, whether there's ground ice present or not. It just doesn't manifest at the surface. But with INSAR, maybe we can learn a little bit more. So let's look at the time series of this ridge. And what we can see is that there was substantial subsidence at the end of this warm summer. So INSAR tells us uniquely that this ridge or hill slope location is rich in ground ice, and that it may become unstable in the coming years and decades. So what we've done so far is we've essentially inferred profiles of ground ice content by waving our hands a bit and doing some model analysis, but in a very qualitative way and in our brains. And what we want to do next is we want to automate this process and make it quantitative. And the way we do that is very similar to what we just described. So we basically have a model that describes how the ground thaws from the top down and how that induces subsidence independence of the amount of ground ice that is present as a function of depth. So that's going to be our forward model. It takes the exercise profile as an input, and as output, it provides a subsidence time series. And what we're going to do is we're going to solve the inverse problem where we observe the subsidence time series, and we do that with INSAR, and we do some pretty, somewhat fancy Bayesian inversion that gives us our best estimate of the excess ice profile at that location, as well as an estimate of its uncertainty, and we quantify that through the Bayesian posterior distribution. There's various types of uncertainty that are present here. There's uncertainty that relates to the observational uncertainty of INSAR, and that is tricky because there's atmospheric errors that have spatial characteristics that are a little bit challenging to include properly into these kinds of inversions. But that's not our only source of uncertainty. There's also uncertainty that relates to the model. And for instance, it relates to the types of assumptions we make about the location that we're modeling in our model. So for instance, how thick is the organic layer? What are its characteristics at the surface? We have to make certain assumptions in our parametrization of the model, and that is also a source of uncertainty that we take into consideration in this Bayesian inversion. So let's actually look at two examples where we drilled lots of cores to validate this type of Bayesian inversion I just showed earlier. So what we did is we went out and used what's called a SIPRI corer that you can see here to drill down to a depth of around 1 meter or so at this location. And because we're looking at a Sentinel-1 pixel, which after our processing is maybe 50 by 50 meters in extent, we actually have to take multiple cores. We took around 15 cores per location to get a profile of the excess ice content as estimated in situ from these cores. And that's what's shown here in blue. And we did that at 2 locations that are called Ice Cut and Happy Valley. So we're showing the in situ cores in blue, and we're showing the INSAR retrievals in brown. And you can see that they match reasonably well at both locations, especially at depth. So at a depth of around 50 centimeters, which is the active layer permafrost boundary, and that's what we really care about because it's this ice right at the permafrost, right at the top of the permafrost, that governs the sensitivity of the ground to instability. Doesn't work quite so well at the surface you can see right at the surface, so at 0 centimeters, there's huge uncertainty, and we estimate elevated ground ice content in the mean, but that's just really driven by this huge uncertainty. And this huge uncertainty is merely due to the fact that we don't have any observations right after snowmelt. And the ground thaws very rapidly at the beginning of the season, so there's basically a top layer of around 10 centimeters where we don't have any information. But overall, especially at depth, what we really care about, these retrievals are promising, so we get the mean accurate reasonably well. There's, however, substantial uncertainty at depth, so in the future we actually want to compare multiple years. We want to combine them to reduce that uncertainty at depth. But that's definitely the kind of information that we can actually use in practice, because when we plan new roads, or if we want to relocate a community, we really need to know whether the top of that permafrost that we can see indications of in a very warm summer, whether that's ice rich or not. And then I want to show you some examples of how that could be used in the future to help communities relocate. Specifically, we're returning to the community of Kivalina, an Inupiat community that's located on a small barrier island, which is being affected by rising sea levels, by increased storm surges as we get less and less sea ice. So they've been trying to relocate, and they want to relocate further inland where they're not so exposed to the sea, but the problem is that there's permafrost present, and that is potentially unstable. And specifically, we're looking at here at a ground ice retrieval profile, so at a transect that's specifically located right here. It's shown in T, with T in the right image. And that transect, it spans an area that appears greenish, and that's because it's rocky. It's called a rocky bench, and it's called the Tachi-Misua rocky bench, which is one of the candidate relocation sites for Kivalina. And the idea is because it's this rocky bench, it may be thaw stable, so it doesn't contain a lot of ice, and that would make it a good location for building infrastructure on, and including buildings for these people to live on. The problem is that the bench itself is very narrow, but there was hope that these stable conditions expand further up and down from that rocky ridge. And it took several federal agencies in the US several decades to actually take these cores. And these cores that were taken at the rocky bench, but also right downslope and upslope of that rocky bench, they show that there is a lot of ground ice in the immediate vicinity of the rocky bench. So it took decades and tens of millions of dollars overall to get these cores to show that Tachi-Misua is not a good candidate location site from a permafrost perspective. Now we can just run our Sentinel-1 ground ice retrieval tool, and it shows us the same thing, namely that the rocky bench itself, that's maybe 150 meters or so wide, that is stable. There's no ground ice there at depth. However, on either side of that rocky bench, it's rich in ground ice at the top of the permafrost. So these locations are not suitable to relocating a community there. So we can now start using INSA for helping planning in the Arctic and helping communities deal with thaw hazards in the Arctic. And we can do that on much larger scales than that specific rocky bench we looked at earlier. So here we're looking at that same location again in Kivalina, the plot you've already seen earlier, where we can really see just how heterogeneous the ground ice contents are estimated to be from INSA, with stable locations corresponding to rocky locations, such as here in the upper left corner. You can see there's a lot of rock that's directly exposed. There's also stable conditions in these river valleys, but those are also hazardous because of floods. So if communities want to relocate or build infrastructure higher up on the landscape, they have to be really careful because a lot of that contains a lot of ground ice. You can see here on the right in this Sentinel-2 image, there's cores that are shown in yellow, including the Tachi-Misua rocky bench I'm looking at earlier. But those are not the only locations. There were several locations that were investigated in order to identify which site may be a good relocation opportunity for Kivalina. And this allows us to actually do some kind of quantitative analysis of how well our ground ice retrievals work. And specifically what we're looking at here is an average of the excess ground ice near the permafrost table. So here we're averaging over depth a little bit to cut down on the uncertainty. And you can see that the excess ice content tends to be low in the core, where that just Taichung-Missouri Rocky Bench location, where we also estimate from INSAR that the ice content is poor, so excess ice contents of around 0. Well, so the marker shows the core. There's also an independent expert-derived map based on the method I indicated earlier of expert interpretation, where we can also see that there's a good correspondence between where that map thinks there's little ground ice and where INSAR identifies low ground ice contents. Similarly, there's pretty good correspondence in locations that are estimated to be rich in ground ice, either based on the map or based on these cores. So INSAR agrees with both of them. But finally, there's also lots of areas where this expert-derived interpretation doesn't really work, so where it couldn't make a decision whether that was ice rich or ice poor. And even there we can see that INSAR can be applied, and it recovers a bimodal distribution where a lot of it is either very poor in ground ice or elevated in ground ice, with not so much in between, with moderate ground ice contents of around 0.1 to 0.2. So just to summarize this part of the talk, we see that INSAR can give vital information on how much ice there is in the ground. And that is really important because that is what exerts a fundamental control on how these landscapes are expected to change with warming, but also with disturbances such as fire. So what I want to do next is to briefly talk about how we can use this type of method to better understand how these landscapes develop on long terms. So we have lots of ice wedges that are present in the Arctic, especially in Alaska. And the problem is that when they degrade, they can make the landscape very uneven, and they can lead to the formation of pits such as and ponds such as the one you can see here. And in this exposure, we see just how much ice there is present. And the problem is that this ice is very close to the surface, and all it takes is 1 or 2 very warm years for this landscape to be transformed completely, which is what happened in the 1990s at this specific locations we can see in the lower left. So you can see there weren't any inundated areas in 1982, and then within a relatively short period of time, by the mid-90s, they were very widespread. So what happened there, what we infer from these high-resolution images, is that a very warm summer triggered subsidence, and it triggered subsidence by eating into the ice. That ice then caused the ground to subside, and that changed the surface energy balance, for instance, by the ponding of water. And then in subsequent, even in cooler summers, there was continued sustained subsidence because the surface conditions had changed. Equally, however, we also see that in many cases, these very warm summers don't trigger continued subsidence. We see that they stabilize. And it may even be that after a very warm summer, if we get into a cooler period, it starts to recover very quickly. The problem is we actually don't have any data on how this is happening in near real time on regional scales. So this is something we can answer with INSAR as well. And specifically looking at this very warm summer near Kivalina that I have centered the talk on, we see that in 2019, there was substantial subsidence of around 5 to 6 centimeters, indicating it really ate into ground ice at the top of the permafrost. However, with INSAR, over multiple years, we can see that that didn't trigger sustained subsidence. It didn't kick off these positive feedback processes. Instead, it recovered very quickly, and actually there was surprisingly fast heave, so the surface started to rise again. And we infer that to be due to the buildup of new ground ice as the depth of the thaw started to decrease again in these cooler years. And that is good news for the resilience of the permafrost, because this new ground ice that forms, it actually can protect these types of ice wedges we just looked at earlier. So with INSAR, we can also improve our understanding of how these permafrost landscapes are evolving over time and what governs their vulnerability to geohazards, or conversely, what endows them with resilience to climate variability. So just to summarize, I briefly wanted to give you several opportunities that I see in the context of using remote sensing for understanding permafrost and permafrost hazards. There's a lot we can still tease out of these remote sensing information that is really critical to understanding the fate of these landscapes. So for instance, just by measuring the subsidence over time, we can learn a lot about the state of the permafrost and whether in any given year, at any given location, the permafrost is being eaten away, so whether it's becoming unstable or whether it's stable. And one example of this is shown here from northwestern Canada, where in 2023 there were several fires, and you can see that in the locations that burned in 2023 there was substantial subsidence in 2024 in the subsequent year. So that tells us how unstable the permafrost is at these locations that burned. And by using data not just from one location and 1 year, we can understand what the regional controls are on how the ground responds to disturbances such as fire or very warm year. And we can use that to improve our understanding of the stability and the fate of these landscapes. On a more practical note, there's also a lot of very actionable data products that, for instance, communities and land managers can use that we can now derive with remote sensing. And there's great opportunities for interdisciplinary collaboration. So there's obviously a lot we can do with INSAR. There's also a lot we can clearly do with high-resolution optical remote sensing. So for instance, one thing you can see here is that over a relatively short time period, again relating to extreme summer warmth, you can see that gullies formed. So these connected water paths that erode over time due to the melting of ice, and they completely change how the water is routed through that landscape. They also change how the conditions for fish are going to be in that main creek that you can see here running through the lower left corner of that image. They also have a big impact on how caribou traverse the landscape. So these kinds of data products we can generate with, for instance, deep learning, they are going to be very useful for the communities and for the federal and state agencies that manage caribou in this landscape. Specifically, when working with communities, there's a great need and a great opportunity for producing and co-producing planning frameworks with them to help them deal with the various hazards I talked about in the context of this talk. So my personal goal there is to really work with the communities directly and with a range of experts to bring in the local knowledge about specific locations where changes are occurring. And that can relate to, for instance, a home becoming unstable, but it could also relate to a berry patch carrying less berries or becoming wetter, or a trail becoming more difficult to traverse. And the idea is to combine that with the knowledge of geotechnical engineers and to bring in remote sensing such as INSAR, subsidence over the landscape, over buildings, as well as optical high-resolution images to help communities plan how to deal with these hazards. Specifically, one community I've been working with is Wainwright, and they were interested in the regional scale distribution of ground ice because they are actually expanding and they're thinking of putting in a new subdivision, and they wanted to know what the ground ice conditions were, or rather to constrain the candidate location sites for the new subdivision so that it's more economical for geotechnical engineers to get higher quality data. So there's lots of opportunities in working directly with communities and with stakeholders in the Arctic to help deal with permafrost hazards, and remote sensing is going to play a big part in that. So overall, there has been rapid progress in monitoring and managing permafrost geohazards, and that relates to various disciplines, and the one I focused on here is remote sensing, where we've seen that there have been 3 areas of remote sensing of ground ice that have advanced rapidly, and putting them together, they help us understand the ground ice conditions across large areas, and thus they help us anticipate hazards and to plan and work with and mitigate these hazards in a sustainable way, from the scale of individual communities to much larger regional areas, for instance, in the context of caribou management. So with that, I would like to end my talk, and thank you very much for your attention. And I'm looking forward to answering questions right now.
Thank you, Simon, for a very, very interesting talk. You have explained many concepts very clearly. And I had a few questions myself, but I see a growing interest in the audience. There are already 11 questions. So I would defer my questions in favor of the participants, and let's get started. So one of the first questions we have from an anonymous attendee is, if we have only descending Sentinel-1 images, can we get the subsidence? Dean Saar.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I made the assumption that we can attribute all the subsidence that we observe to the melting of ground ice, or all the terrain motion that we pick up with INSAR to the melting of ground ice. But on slopes, that clearly isn't the case, because their materials just move down slope. And in order to tease out the component that is due to an actual subsidence versus that component of the movement that relates to downslope motion, we can't just use a single satellite pass or a single direction into which or along which we measure the displacements. And in that case, we really want to use at least two passes or two directions. The problem is that with Sentinel-1 across much of the Arctic, we currently only have one, but yeah, with new satellite products such as NISA, we'll do a better job in that respect.
There are a couple of questions related to this question, actually, so I would not go in sequence now. But Murtaza Nadeem asked that, how do we ensure that the observed subsidence from Sentinel-1 INSAR reflects actual ground deformation and not changes in surface ice thickness due to melting? And another related question was whether we can classify seismically induced subsidence from ground ice induced subsidence.
Yeah, so these questions get at a very important point, and that is, it's really challenging to take the INSAR observations that we gather and process and relate them to actual ground subsidence, as opposed to other factors that influence the INSAR signal. So we're putting a lot of effort into dealing with atmospheric disturbances so atmospheric errors in our INSAR signal. We do that through the uncertainty model. We also put a lot of effort into setting up good reference points and reference frames, so that, for instance, we are not sensitive to tectonic deformation. But there's also other challenges that we have a much poorer handle on, and that relates, for instance, to surface changes, such as a change in the vegetation cover over time that may lead to signals that look like subsidence, but they actually just reflect changes in the vegetation at the surface. And that's a big challenge for us, and more broadly for the INSAR community, to really tease apart these various factors that influence our observations.
Right. A question from the participant named Nazul Amin. How, through using satellite remote sensing, historical flood in permafrost region can be analyzed and mapped? It's a little related to flooding.
Yeah, so flooding is another big hazard that a lot of communities in the Arctic are facing, and it's especially the spring floods that are hazardous when the rivers are choked with ice, and then you get a lot of water coming in as the snow melts. This is usually dealt with in a separate way, so there's not too much overlap with the permafrost hazards I was focusing on here, but it's clearly a big challenge. Having said that, there is increasing interest in understanding the linkages between river floods or floods that relate to the sea and high sea levels to changing in permafrost, because we've seen several examples in Alaska in recent years, where floods triggered subsidence and permafrost degradation in subsequent years. So yeah, it's a very good point. There's clearly a lot of interesting research questions in that context. But I'm not aware of any studies specifically looking at historical floods and their impacts on communities and on the permafrost surrounding that communities.
Right. A couple of questions from Syed Hamad Ali. Do you think ground penetrating radar is an effective method for identifying permafrost areas? And how does permafrost thawing impact water quality?
Okay, two great questions. The first one, so GPR is used to study permafrost. It's very good for understanding how deep that active layer, so how deep that, at the end of the summer, how deep that thawed layer is. It's not as useful in practice for understanding how much ice there is in the ground. And for that, there are other near-surface geophysical techniques that are used, such as georesistivity approaches, so electrical resistivity approaches. The second question was about water quality. That's a big concern. There's several ways in which permafrost thaw influences water quality. I'll just take this image here as an example. So as the permafrost thaws, for instance, after the fire, there's a lot of surface erosion that typically is concomitant with that, and that can lead to the transport of sediments into lakes and into the rivers, and we saw that with the thaw slump as well. There's other ways in which permafrost thaw affects water quality, and if you look closely at this river, you can actually see it's orange, and this relates to something called acid rock drainage. And we've seen across many locations in the Arctic that as the ground gets warmer and as there is more groundwater flow, a lot of rivers have turned orange, killing off all the fish and the other animals that live in there, because these orange waters tend to have a pH that's extremely low at around 3. So it's very acidic, and it's another concern that relates to water quality in these changing permafrost landscapes.
Right. So we have a couple of questions related to the software that you have used in your work, one from Sabine Kimiri and another one from Ali Raza. So would you like to comment on that? And a related question was about vegetation cover in non-coherent regions where your INSAR processing might have led to some gaps in your deformation time series. So did you remove them based on some coherence thresholding or something? So basically, which processing software you are mostly using?
So for processing the INSAR time series, we use both in-house code, but recently we've also been using the MintPy package, because that's what a lot of people are using for doing something called SBAS processing, but a very commonly used package that we can also use the outputs of to drive this Bayesian inversion workflow. So that Bayesian inversion is pretty modular, and you can run it in different configurations, including with different types of INSAR products. This Bayesian inversion software you can find on my GitHub, so it's all in Python and Cython code. You can use, it's all open source. I don't know whether I should comment any more on that software. The other question was dealing with low coherence areas. And yeah, that is a problem. We tend to be rather liberal in when it comes to masking, so we don't mask out too many areas of low coherence. And the reason for that is that in this Bayesian inversion, we keep track of the decorrelation-induced uncertainty. And if the coherence is low, as long as we can reliably unwrap the INSAR data, then we just deal with that higher level of uncertainty. And we see that in the outputs as well, but it's all captured by our posterior uncertainty estimate, so we live with it. Having said that, it's actually pretty difficult to predict what the coherence levels will be. So one thing we found over Fairbanks is that in the boreal forest, the coherence quite often is very high, despite all the trees that are present, depending on the type of forest that is present. So there's no clear-cut relationship between the vegetation cover and the coherence conditions, and other factors also play a major role, such as the wetness.
Right. Another question, any of your work related to Indian glaciers? Question by Mohit.
I have not, no, but I'd be interested in learning more about them.
Right, right. And what is the impact of a community settled area versus a rural area in terms of the accuracy of the methods? That's a question from Joyce. Would you comment on that?
So the way we run the model, it works better in areas that are not built up, and that's because the presence of buildings and construction that really changes the thermal balance. That's something, and the thermal regime, something our forward model can't capture. And also typically there's a lot of small scale variability that we can't pick up well with Sentinel-1 INSAR because its resolution is relatively coarse. So for these two reasons, we focus on regional scale analyses in areas that are not extensively built up for the most part. So when we're working with communities, we tend to apply to the areas surrounding the communities. For instance, with Kivalina, that's not a community we're actively working with, but there we looked at locations outside of the community to see what the permafrost conditions are and to suggest locations where that town could be relocated to. Or at least that's already all done in the past and was very expensive, but in the future, that's the kind of analysis we anticipate doing.
Right, so we are over time now, but I have still 6 more questions to go, and I'm really sorry to the audience that I may not be able to take all because of limited time, but I would still quickly ask Simon, given the opportunity, can you comment on in situ data? That's a question asked by one participant, that how hard it is to get, and what's your experience with that?
It's a lot of work. So we have some, but not too many locations where we measure ground temperatures, or for the most part, it's colleagues who do that. What we need to directly validate the ground ice estimates that we get from INSAR or from any other remote sensing method is the gold standard is to really take these cores I described doing. And I mentioned we took 10 to 15 at each of these 2 sites. Taking one core can take somewhere between 1 to 5 hours, depending on the conditions. So in order to get to make these 2 plots you can see here, it was 5 people working basically every day for a week in 2 teams. And it's pretty tough work. And after that, we have to do a lot of analysis in the lab, which takes several more weeks of work effort by multiple students to do. So it's really difficult to get high quality in situ data relating to ground ice. And that's been one of the limiting factors in understanding how well this method works and also what aspects of it need improvement. And yeah, we're always looking for collaborators to share ground ice data with. And there is actually an action group of the International Permafrost Association. I didn't really have time to highlight. But one of their goals is also to share and make ground ice data more accessible to help with planning in the Arctic and also to help people working on remote sensing products validate their ground ice products.
Right. With apology to the participants who have asked questions, we are over time, and I would like to stop here, and let's thank our speaker for today, Dr. Simon Zwieback, for giving us this valuable information, for giving us his valuable time. Thanks a lot, Simon. And I would like to end here with one of the questions from a participant, that is there any symposium in near future where these kind of research can be applied and so on? So I would say yes. We have the IGARS coming up this year in Washington, DC in August. So we'd be consider joining it. So it's an excellent platform for different applied research. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Simon. That's all for today. Hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.